Hello everyone, this is Many Ninjas, and we're going to call this part 2 of the Saiyan Raised on Earth bootleg video set, because we're going to do a full-blown breakdown of the toy at this point. Now, starting off from the top, in order to kind of figure things out, I kind of popped off both the neck and the head, because I wanted to see if it's possible to kind of mix and match points with the Super Saiyan 3 bootleg we've had from before. But for reasons we're going to be looking at, that turns out to be quite impossible, because the innards are, as expected, different, but even more different than I would have expected. Namely, for starters, there's a ball point in the top there, which is much different from what the Saiyan or Super Saiyan 3 bootleg has. But what I noticed, which is really weird, there's a screw in the center of that whole thing, and I don't think I've seen anything along those lines since the original 1.0 bootleg. So that's going to be interesting. We need to get inside the torso, but to get there first, we need to remove everything around it. So starting off, the first arm just pops right off. On a real figure it would take a little more effort, but in this case it pops off because it's just poorly cast, and then we start to see, of course, the odd orange shoulder that we'll be able to just slide off with a little bit of work. A little wiggling will get it off there. Same thing on the other side. And we can see the bit of a, what's supposed to be kind of the ball joint, and a bit of a weird looking socket here. Can't get a perfect view from this angle, but once we get the whole torso off, it'll become a little more apparent what we're looking at here. Just worth noting though, because of how the back part of the torso is set up right now, it doesn't move particularly well. There might be something that can be done to address that, but first we need to get there. Moving onward, the legs themselves, because of the odd pivot joint, it's actually a little easy to remove them if anything. They just pop off for the most part. And we can see, while there is a bit of a rotating part near the top there, it's not the proper swiveled kind of joint in the middle there that the 2.0s are supposed to have. It's kind of just a stuck-in joint, which will be a little more apparent with this next bit where I'm trying to remove leg number 2, and well, it doesn't come out cleanly. It actually pops out the little turning bit that I'm just describing here. So if we look on there, that's what the inside looks like on the bootleg here. It's just a simplified version of the joint here, and also on the actual body itself, it's going to be a little hard to remove here, but that's what it looks like on the inside middle part. And it's just really stuck on the peg at this point, so I'm actually going to have to mess around with this a little more off camera in order to kind of fix it up, because it's just stuck. In terms of getting the torso and hips separated, it's kind of what you expect at this point in a lot of these bootlegs. Namely, the middle part is a bit of a rubberized piece, while the hips are a little more harder plastic, so everything's being held really together by a single ball peg, and once you pull it out, this is kind of what it looks like here. It seems a little interesting because looking at the hips, the ball peg is its own separate piece being held in place along with other things, so we need to crack that open to see in a minute. But first, a small little aside in terms of the head. Like I was mentioning in the earlier video here, the face pegs on this bootleg all fit properly in this case, which is a nice surprising change of pace comparing to the Super Saiyan 3 faces. But if you were to try to use the real faces from the Saiyan Raised on Earth in here, they won't quite fit because the pegs are physically smaller on the bootlegs than they are on the real faces. So yeah, as you can see, they just stick out a bit too much. You need to trim them out to make them fit, but we're not going to do that. What we are going to do is take a look at the hips now that I've got them separated in this case. So you can see now there are two separate bits of plastic kind of held together, and they're being used to sandwich some other bits together in this case. Namely, oddly enough, the ball peg is its own separate piece, which I find interesting because in other bootlegs I've seen, it's either a larger separate piece or it's connected, fused together. And in terms of what makes the leg swing, there are pretty much kind of hinges and such that are being used to hold the place. They do kind of fit in only in a specific order. It's worth mentioning in this case, so if you do separate this, you really want to keep in mind what order you take them apart in. And you can also see on the hips, or the leg hinges there, whatever it's called, there is a left and a right distinction. So that's also worth noting, kind of help keep things in the right order there. What I found the most interesting is when I broke that upper torso apart, by managing to pull apart the kind of smaller lower torso, which was a bit of a rubberized piece. At this point, not a huge surprise, but when I broke the torso apart here, I found in the middle a really simplified version of the joining system and more of the kind of somewhere between 1.0 and 2.0, I think. As you can see, there's that screw that was being used to hold everything together, tying it to the back piece in this case. But yeah, just looking even at the back piece, let's just take a quick look there. it looks like it should have had room in order to fit a proper butterfly joint system, but because that one long piece of plastic on each side, they kind of filled in the gap there, and it wouldn't actually be able to fit a proper butterfly joint anymore at this point. So instead they use this really weird looking kind of simplified ball joint system all around. Ball joint for the neck in the middle, as well as the little lower torso, that's a bigger, fatter ball in the case. And on the end, there's a suction system, like a ball joint suction cup that's being used to hold the shoulder in place. And it's supposed to mimic the butterfly joint, but because of how poorly casted and incredibly tight fitted they are, they really don't move a lot. So that's a bit odd. Let's start moving on to the legs in this case. Namely, I'm actually going to bring over the Super Saiyan 3 bootleg in this case to help kind of emphasize the point. If you look at the cast carefully, aside from the different color, it's the same leg overall. They just kind of reuse the same thing they used for the Super Saiyan 3 figure in order to kind of copy the cast over, since you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's the same leg for the most part. However, what this bootleg did is, rather than cast a separate bit for a proper set of articulations and more detailed joining system, they cast it all together as one piece on the main hips there, and used their own much cheaper to assemble kind of a leg rotation kind of ball joint system in order to make that work, which actually unfortunately limits rotation as a whole. Moving down towards the feet in this case, here's what it looks like when you pull the ball socket out of the foot in this case, or out of the leg. What you have is a ball joint with one end, the one that plugs into the leg, having an extremely long socket that, like I said, plugs into the leg itself, not the boot, which itself is hollow, interesting enough. Although it does seem to match what I've seen in some other older figures as well, so that's worth noting. And in terms of the foot in this case, it's pretty simple for the most part, nothing surprising. Although I will mention while I'm here that a little discovery I noticed, because the toe itself uses a bit of a softer piece of kind of the same rubber material as the boot. If you heat it up and kind of squeeze it to push it back into place, you can actually re-tighten the toe joint a bit, so it will actually be a tighter fit than it was when I was originally showing it in the first video, which is what I just did here in order to kind of emphasize the point and kind of get it back towards more of a working order, and what I believe I did off camera for the second foot as I was working on it in order to kind of try to loosen the ball peg a bit. Speaking of which, here's the other foot in question with everything still attached. As you can see, at this time the toe is still a little loose, but it's a little better. But here's what it looks like kind of just pulling the thing right out for the ball joint here. I'm going to use a pair of pliers. Actually, I don't even need a pair of pliers to pull it out. It was actually simple enough. And in this case, the foot took the whole ball joint with it. And even then, that's not a huge issue. You can honestly pull the ball joint right out there still pretty easily, but there's just proof of concept of what it looks like in place. Probably be useful in order to get it back in there later. And speaking of which, one more proof of concept. We took the entire boot off in this case. It took a little effort because that's actually really well stuck on, and in fact I think the rubber part melted a little bit in order to remove it there. So it's indeed one hollow piece of kind of rubberized plastic on there, but if you intend to kind of repaint certain parts of the boot, you really do need to remove this part in order to get there. And as you can see, the boots are entirely separate pieces there. You don't really need the boot to actually hold the thing in place. Proof of concept once again. Here's the thing being, or the joint being plugged right back into the leg itself, and it holds in place no problem whatsoever. The actual holding mechanism or holding joint is inside the leg itself, and the boot itself is just hollow. It's more decor than anything. Just one little note I will mention as I was removing things on here. While the ankles do pop off, no issue. In this case, I accidentally took apart the knee part as well. Thankfully, it plugs right back in. So you can take everything apart if you really need to, but just be careful that you don't pull too hard and mess up the knee joints in the process. And speaking of which, one more example here. Let's try if I can get this to the right angle. Might be a little hard to see on camera, but as you can see, the ankle joint does not go all the way through. It's got a little suction bit, so there is some separation in there, which is good to know. So at least you don't have to worry about accidentally going too far and driving one peg right into another. So that's just something worth noting. And I believe with that, that kind of shows off everything I wanted to show with this particular bootleg in this case. In terms of would I recommend this bootleg once again? No, I would definitely strongly recommend getting this, even for customization purposes. The real figure is reasonably priced enough that it's worth getting, and if you get this one, you have to deal with nonsense like this weird internal shoulder joint, which it's so badly casted and fitted that it's going to take some serious work to loosen this up so it'll even really get close to the same range as a normal butterfly joint. It's almost not worth the trouble, but I'm going to try it anyway, maybe for part 3 of this video set. Just showing you, it's just terribly casted. Honestly, it's a total mess there. In terms of the hips, once again, I'm going to repeat, you're literally fabricating joints in order to kind of recreate a proper 2.0 articulation in this case. That's supposed to be a separate piece there. Let me bring over the Super Saiyan 3 body one more time here. You can see it's literally its own piece of plastic there. There's the actual leg articulation, which actually operates on a swivel, not just a pure ball joint. That is just completely missing from this particular bootleg, even though it's supposed to use, relatively speaking, the same body. And in terms of other things, well, I would say the arms are actually surprisingly competently done in this case. The wrist joint, the extra hands come on and off, actually notably better than a lot of the other bootlegs I've come across this point. It's actually a pleasant surprise there, but the rest of the body is such a wash that it's actually it's disappointing, if anything. So if you wanted to, maybe you could take those arms and use them somewhere else in this case, especially the hand wrist. In terms of the ankle joints, realistically, you'd need to be drilling into the foot in order to get them to really sink in properly, and you'd have to mess with a long peg and really shrink it back down to size and make it fit properly. It can be done, might be more effort than it's worth, but it's just putting it out there. I might experiment with it later just to see how it might work. And yeah, all in all, I think that's this toy in a nutshell here. I don't recommend buying it, but hopefully you learned something from my little expenditure here. Take care, everyone.